Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This podcast is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox, a new online collection of practical, trusted resources made for those who support global missions from home. Visit us online at globalmissionstoolbox.com to register for access to this growing collection of tools for senders. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. I am here with our co-host, Maddie. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing well. It's good to be here again. How are you, Megs?
I'm doing all right. We're recording this in October, though, and I got to say it's getting cooler. So summer is ending, and there's no white stuff quite yet, but we're getting there.
It is a pretty dreary day, but we're glad to be here recording the Global Missions Podcast, and we want to say welcome to our listeners. We are looking forward to today's episode and hope you are too, as we've received feedback for the podcast from our listeners, primarily through the listener survey that we ran this summer, as well as from our advisory group, which we meet with about quarterly. One of the things that we've heard is the suggestion to incorporate more voices from the global church. And this episode is one chance that we get to do that on this podcast. We're looking forward to it.
We really affirm the importance of really having both. We want to acknowledge that most of our listening audience lives in North America, but that great value of hearing global voices in these missions conversations as we engage with what God is doing around the world. Our guest today is an author and editor who will take us to Asia. She has helped put together a collection of sermons and writings from the Chinese church.
Yes. So this is actually a unique conversation in that we get to hear the wisdom and encouragement of our brothers and sisters in China through our guest, Hannah. So let's get into today's conversation.
Our guest today is Hannah Nation, who serves as the managing director for the Center for House Church Theology, as well as the content director for China Partnership. She is a student of world missions and world Christianity, really, and has been a close observer to the new chapter of church history unfolding across China. She herself is an author and has contributed to the Gospel Coalition and Christianity Today and Plow, and she's also an editor, including having edited the 2022 book, Faith in the Wilderness, Words of Exhortation from the Chinese Church. We're going to look at that today. But Hannah, just before we talk about the book, would you please just take a moment and share with us, how did you become interested in what's happening in Chinese house churches?
Yeah, well, I first went to China in 2005. I was a college undergrad in between my sophomore and junior year and went to teach English and just was really blown away by China. And how many people are there. And I was a history major, history nerd. And even as an undergrad, I really had a sense that what was happening there was significant for church history, just with the growth of the gospel and the church across China. And I just wanted to be a part of it. I remember thinking, even if it was for a short period of time, I wanted to say that I had been involved somehow. And it's just essentially grown from there. I don't think it was something I anticipated would end up being a long-term calling, but the Lord has his plans, and here I am.
Very good. Now, Hannah serves with an organization or a ministry called the Center for House Church Theology. At that center, Hannah, just tell us a little bit about the mission of that ministry.
Our mission really is to help share the voices of the Chinese house church with the rest of the global church. For a lot of reasons, it has historically been hard to access the house churches and to really be able to engage what they're preaching about and thinking about. And just through a lot of different avenues, we've been given access. And we believe that there is a maturity and just a spiritual vitality within those house churches that the global church can benefit from. So we do a lot of translation and a lot of publishing, really to elevate their voices and help engage outside of China.
So helpful. And I just wanted to lift that a little bit. We're going to talk about one particular publication, but I love that idea of lifting the voice and appreciate so much, Hannah, your work on these types of things. As we mentioned in the introduction, Hannah is an editor and co-edited the 2022 book we're going to talk about today. It's entitled Faith in the Wilderness, Words of Exhortation from the Chinese Church. And it's a group of sermons. It's a compilation of sermons, right? Hannah, just tell us a little about the book generally before we get into some specifics.
Yeah, it's a compilation of sermons. They've been turned into, you might call them kind of sermonic letters or addresses. And they were preached through 2020, really at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And basically, they came out of, there was a large convention of church leaders from across Asia that took place at the beginning of 2020, right when the Wuhan lockdown took place and COVID was really breaking out. And as a result, there were many hopeful attendees from China who weren't able to participate. And the leaders decided to live stream into China, and there were tens of thousands of devices logging in. And so they went on, and once the convention ended, they decided this is really the time to evangelize. This is a time to be bold. And so they continued to have these online open access preaching weekend events, maybe kind of like an old school tent revival, but in the digital space. And these sermons were all part of that. So they're very evangelistic in nature, but also very much with an eye to encouraging Christians throughout the pandemic. And when we heard about it, we just thought, this is going to be really wonderful content. And so we asked for permission to begin translating and eventually had enough content for the book. So the book really moves from, it has 3 sections. It opens with meditations on brokenness and just opens with some pretty deep examinations of just the state of our world and the reality of the brokenness of the world. And then it moves from there to hope and to really hope in where we are going and our final destination. And so I think they're very meditative, they're very reflective, but they're also very powerful and deeply convicting in many ways.
Well, we will talk a little bit more of the themes that come out of the book here. Hannah, I wonder whether you just sketch for us a little bit about the authors, maybe not specific authors, but what can you tell us about who's contributing these messages?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so all of the authors are pastors of house churches from across China. They really represent a pretty geographically diverse group. And also, I would say they represent kind of a diversity of ecclesiology. Some of the pastors come from a more Baptistic background. Some of them are very Reformed, even Presbyterian. Some of them are non-denominational. But they all, I would say, really are committed to the gospel of grace and the centrality of that for the Christian and for the church. And they are also all very committed to serving their cities and things like church planting and evangelism, and really wanting to move from a kind of inward faith to a very outward active faith that's engaging their culture and their cities.
Right. Well, it has been a blessing for me to engage in this book, and just noting too, the pandemic brought so many challenges. It did bring some blessings as well. And many more people were able to participate, not only in the conference itself, I understand, Hannah, that you mentioned, but since then, because of these tools that have been refined and opened up. And so we're thankful for that, and way to go for helping to lift these voices, as you've said. It's really good. Now, many in our audience are going to be serving in local churches, Hannah. They're maybe serving on missions committees. Many are volunteers, and they can read books. Of course, it's really helpful to have recommendations as to which are going to be helpful. So let's think of them in particular. How do you see this particular book being beneficial to a missions committee in a local church?
Yeah, I love this question. I've served on missions committees myself and actually really had them in mind with the creation of this book in many ways. And I would say my belief is that really in order for us to be good partners with the global church, we must first be learners. And I think, this is true of any relationship. Good friends are curious to know more about each other. Good marriages are built on communication. And so it's true of our local churches and it's true of the global church that being able to hear from each other and listen to each other is important for relationships. So I think it's often rare for people on missions committees to be able to hear directly from local Christians, or at least there are a lot of challenges to that usually. And so this book is really an opportunity for any missions committee to engage directly the spirituality and the teaching of the house churches and hear what they have to say about the gospel. So I think for any missions committee that has ever invested in China, this is a great resource demonstrating the growth and the maturity of these churches. But also, I think even for those who haven't had connections to China, just generally engaging teaching from local churches around the world helps give us perspective that I think really should inform our sending efforts. Again, just basically because as partners and as senders, we also really must be listening and learning. So yeah, I encourage all missions committees and missions pastors to read this book. And just, along with theology of missions books, missiology books, I think this is a great supplemental book to help round out everything that informs what a committee does.
It's good. I think just to give people an idea of it, I have one in my hand, a copy in my hand. Of course, it's about 150 pages, and it's broken, as Hannah said, into 3 major categories, but the separate messages would be 8 or 10 pages, a series of sermons, as we get to listen to the voice of the church in China. So I encourage you to consider that book, Faith in the Wilderness. Now, Hannah, as we turn to learn from this, you can help summarize this for us. We'd like to talk about some of the lessons that we in the Western Church can learn from, or maybe be reminded of, at least, from our sisters and brothers in Chinese house churches. So let's head along that way. What are some of the lessons you'd like to lift out of the book for us?
Well, the first lesson is really about suffering. That's the major theme throughout the book. And I would say what the Chinese church really has to teach us is that suffering is part of the Christian's walk with Christ. And I think that is often a hard truth for us in the Western world, where we are very comfortable and we really don't like to think or talk about suffering. We kind of deal with it.
We try to avoid it.
Yeah, I think we try to avoid it and we deal with it when it rears its head, but it's not something that is, really in the water of our conversations a lot. But for the Chinese church, that's very different. And they really are very bold in saying that in his life on this earth, Jesus's life was marked by suffering. And the servant is not above the master and the student is not above the teacher. And so if we are to follow in Christ's footsteps, we are likewise called to participate in his suffering. So, and this isn't, I think, anything new in the history of the church. This is historic church teaching, but because of their lived experiences, they are much more acquainted with this perspective.
Oh, that's really good. Much more acquainted with it. I heard when I said a moment ago, we try and avoid suffering. I'm not sure we shouldn't try and avoid suffering. That would be reasonable, but to be acquainted with it. And we have not been as acquainted in the West. We've been relatively comfortable, safe. We value security and insurance and certainty and safety. What I've seen in what I've read here is that this is to be an expected piece. We can expect to experience suffering.
Yeah. And I think even as much as we do live in comfort, we all experience suffering at different times in life, even in the comfortable Western world. And so one of the values of listening to and learning to people who are more closely acquainted with it, as I stated, is just that I think they have a lot to help us when we do encounter suffering, to know how to suffer and how to be faithful to Christ in the midst of it.
Some are of the mind that things are going to, can I say, in the West, get worse. What do I mean by that? It's going to get more and more difficult to be a faithful Christ follower in the West. And as that is true, to the degree that's true, we can learn from those who are already acquainted and have proven faithful under suffering and under persecution. And so we can very helpfully learn in our timeline from our sisters and brothers there. I wonder, Hannah, whether you could describe for us what some of the suffering looks like for our Christian friends in Chinese house churches.
Yeah, it's varied. So, there's quite a spectrum of different things they may encounter. Obviously, persecution is kind of the big the big word. So, but even persecution within China can look very different. It can range from very extreme cases in which a pastor might be arrested and incarcerated and kept in jail for lengthy periods of time, or it can be much more subtle, like your landlord evicting you because they don't want to have troublesome Christians in their building, or, harassment and pressure from your workplace. So even the topic of persecution is very varied. But I think even apart from that, just the realities of life in China are challenging. A lot of the persecution or the suffering that is discussed in the book or mentioned in the book is not necessarily about persecution. It's about things that we might find more immediately relatable. Like one pastor talks about, he had a young son who passed away and the suffering that comes with that. There's also in the book discussion of just, you might say, the suffering that comes from our everyday relationships. One pastor talks about a fight with his wife. And so I think there are versions of suffering that they discuss that are not very similar to what we experience. And there are other things that they discuss that are very similar.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good to know it's relatable, and it's not only when someone is taken away to prison that these lessons would be useful to us too. I'm wondering, this question I'd like to ask is suffering glorified through this discussion? Are we lifting it up? And does that take place? Do Chinese house churches actually glorify this behavior, that it's a badge, so to speak?
That is an excellent question. I've been asked this question by some of my personal friends as they have engaged the book. I think, there definitely are churches and places where suffering, I think, does become glorified. But as a whole, I don't think that is the overall problem or the overall risk with this. I think that in some ways it's very pragmatic. In some ways, the Chinese have a very often pragmatic outlook on life. And I think just their willingness and their ability to sit with the realities of suffering come from that. But also, it just really, truly has marked the history of the house churches and even beyond that, the history of Christianity in China. And they have so much to draw from in scripture that talks about and wrestles with topics of suffering. I mean, the entirety of the Psalms almost really takes us to those spaces. So, I think in some ways our problem in the West is our forgetfulness of these topics and our avoidance of them. And so one of the things that I really love about the material that we work with coming from the house churches in China is how much I think they give us an appropriate ability to think about this without glorifying it. And they give us a language and a vocabulary for talking about suffering that I find to be very helpful.
Well, it's really good. It needs to be kept in its proper place. And I like your language of reminding the church in the West when we're shocked. What is this difficulty? That the Lord does have purposes in it. Others have walked deeply through these things. Well, in a moment, Hannah's going to share some more lessons that we can learn or be reminded of from Chinese house churches about our posture toward those who try to harm us. Before we get to that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this tool that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
The Prayer for the Persecuted Church calendars help you guide your prayers for those who live in areas where their worship may need to be done in a house church context, like we are hearing about today. If you have ever wanted a larger perspective on the global church and how you can pray for persecuted Christians, this tool will help you to structure your prayer life with specific and current prayer requests for each day of the month. This tool is contributed by Open Doors. You can download your copy by clicking the link in our show notes or by going to globalmissionstoolbox.com.
We are back with Hannah Nation from the Center for House Church Theology. Hannah, what's another lesson that you'd like to share with us today from our sisters and brothers in China?
I think there's a lot to learn from them about having the right posture towards those who would desire to harm them or to harm us. I'm constantly amazed at the testimonies that I hear just when people are taken in for questioning or, even spend time in jail, how much that does not quench their desire to continue to love their cities and continue to serve the people around them. And several of the pastors whose writings I've worked with, they have said things essentially making the point that when Christians are put in jail, they're often put in jail with the drug dealers and the prostitutes and demographics of their cities that it is often hard for them to reach with the gospel. And they use those times in jail to actively preach the gospel with people that they don't interact with a whole lot outside of jail. So I think it takes an incredible understanding of the grace of God, I think, to go into a period of incarceration with your primary desire being to share the gospel with the people you're incarcerated with. But also, they really have just shared wonderful testimonies of seeing their call to preach the gospel to those who are interrogating them. There's one story that I can think of a young mother who was arrested and brought in for questioning. And she talks about how, she was very angry at first, and she was arguing very strongly with the people who were questioning her, and how she essentially had this moment of realizing that, similar to the drug sellers, this person who was a police person who was interrogating her probably had never heard the gospel either. And this was an opportunity to share the gospel with those who were seeking to harm them. And so she just talks about this kind of spirit-filled change in her heart and her desire to make her interrogation a testimony to the truth of the gospel. So I think there's just a lot from these brothers and sisters in China to consider about how we think about those who want to harm the church.
Right. Well, it puts me in mind actually of the Apostle Paul in Philippians, for example, where he said, "Here I am in prison, I've been arrested, but just so you know, as a result of this, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard that I'm in chains for Christ." And it was opportunity, right? I mean, he didn't plan to be there. He didn't want to be there, I don't think, but it was certainly opportunity. What I appreciate about what you just shared about that mom is we might need a transition of our own thinking about this. Paul was there, it seems. We need to get there, and that change of heart that says, boy, the Lord could be purposeful in this difficulty as well. This is opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they often talk about using the ride in the police car to the police center as a time to personally repent of their own idols and to prepare to preach the gospel. And I think that first part is really absolutely necessary that when you are under attack, when you are under duress, your first response is to be defensive and combative. And only when we take a posture of repenting of our own idols are we really able to see outside of ourselves and see the needs surrounding you in the police center and have that heart change.
It's so helpful, Hannah, to hear the actual stories of people. The mother you mentioned, someone riding in the police car. Are there any other examples that you might just share to illustrate where the church or members of the church have really had a right posture toward those who really are desiring to harm them?
Yeah, so there's another story I can think of where essentially there was a church that was under a lot of pressure, and the pastor had police guards stationed outside of his apartment building. He wasn't on house arrest, but he did have kind of this low-level several police officers just stationed outside of his door all the time. And they were limiting the number of people from his church who could come into his home and come visit him in his home. So he and his wife, they just decided, okay, we can't have people over to our home for dinner. So we're going to take our dinner out onto the street and we'll just all eat dinner out on the street. And so they took their table and their chairs and would set it up out on the street next to these police officers, and they would have people over to eat together and fellowship together out in the street. And during that, they would also talk with these police officers and chat with them. And so it's a great example of not, in a sense, giving in, but really wanting to maintain a posture of love and of service, even in the midst of really direct harassment. And yeah, we always say this story makes us think of, you set my table before my enemies, and just how much these very basic things, I think they are what form your testimony and they are what form your witness to those who are seeking you harm.
Well, those are some beautiful examples on a personal level. I wonder how the church as a whole has approached those who would seek to oppress or to cause harm.
Yeah, the Chinese house churches, they really love their cities. They love their country. They love China. They are generally seeking to be good citizens to the fullest extent they're able to. They generally talk about wanting to submit to their authorities as fully as they possibly can, but to the point where they are not limiting the work of the church. So I think there's not a lot of kind of anti-China sentiment. And I think a lot of that is apparent in their just ongoing desire to evangelize and to plant churches. I know of another pastor who his church was pretty large and they were coming under pressure. And so they decided, okay, we're going to plant churches. And they planted like 9 churches in 1 year all across their city. And those churches have all now grown significantly. And so I think if we're led by this posture of love and of service, then we really just can see the fruit of the gospel, even under harsh circumstances. So, yeah, I think really church planting and evangelism remains really strong. And it's always an interesting dynamic because even though the authorities are often not happy about these things, the Chinese really are doing this out of love for their country and love for their cities and a desire to bless and to serve the people around them.
That's good. It's really good. Well, again, Hannah's book that she helped edit together with Simon is entitled Faith in the Wilderness. I wonder, Hannah, if you have suggestions for missions committees back to our local churches here in the West. How practically could they use a book like this, Faith in the Wilderness?
So I would say this is just, in my mind, a book that I'd love to see missions committees buy and read and study together. There is a study guide that accompanies the book that can be found on the Center for House Church Theology's website. So I think, just for their own learning and growth as a committee, going through that as a group is valuable. There's also the ability to encourage your churches to read the book and study the book more broadly throughout the church. My church here, several of the community groups have been reading the book together and going through the study guide as a group conversation. So I think it's a really great way actually for a missions committee to help the broader congregation engage the idea of the global church. This book is very accessible. You don't have to know much about China or much about missions generally to be able to read it and benefit from it. My grandma, who really, does not know much about China at all, read it and just loved it. So it's a very easy tool for missions committees to use for helping bring a global heart to their churches.
So very helpful to add the study guide, Hannah. And for you listening to the podcast, you can find the show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com. And there we will include links to the study guide in case you'd like to access that resource. As our listeners might like to learn more about this topic, Hannah, about the church in China and especially facing difficulty and persecution, are there other recommended resources you would mention?
Yeah, there are 2 that I would highlight. The first is just the Center for House Church Theology website. We actually just added a new page there that really tries in very simple layman's terms to answer the question, what is the house church? Because that's a question we get quite a lot. And then there just are a lot of free translations of longer essays that have been written by house church pastors on that website and accompanying study guides. But the other thing I would really highlight too is that we have another book coming out in December already. This book is called Faithful Disobedience: Writings from a House Church Movement on Church and State. And this book comes from a pastor. His name is Wang Yi, and he is actually currently in jail. He is serving a 9-year jail sentence. He is an excellent writer, a fascinating thinker, and this book is a collection of his writings on the question of what is the church and how does the church engage society around it. And they're just wonderful. And We've added a lot of additional commentary, not only to help explain what he's saying, but also to tell his story and the story of his church and what led to his arrest in 2018.
All right. Wow. What a topic, or a title rather, Faithful Disobedience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, look forward to that. If anyone would like to reach out to you after having heard this episode, Hannah, how can they best reach you?
So they can email us directly at info@housechurchtheology.com. They can, as I said, visit the website. I would really recommend getting on our mailing list. We send out, our newsletters are always full of resources. But you can also find me and the center on social media. Yeah, we're pretty easy to find.
Okay, very good. Well, we will include all of those links in the show notes as well. So if you'd like to follow up with Hannah or learn more about the center and some of the work that they're doing, then you'll be able to do that. Hannah, I like to save this question for last. If you have the opportunity to stand in front of a missions committee and imagine the pastor being there, these are people that would like to do a great job of global missions from their church, and you could speak to them related to this topic, what would you like to say to them?
I would like to encourage them to seek out any way they can to learn from those that they are serving. The global church has just riches and their knowledge of the Lord that we really benefit from. And I often think of just the image of the body that Paul talks about, the head and the hand, and just how much we need each other. And we not only are called to send and to serve, but we need them as well, and we need their perspectives. And so they bless us, and it's an amazing opportunity just that we get to hear from them and learn from them.
That's a great word. Hannah, we want to thank you for your work, both to write and to edit and then to publish and to help lift the voices of our brothers and sisters in China. And thank you for joining us today on the Global Missions Podcast.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Well, we hope you have found this episode to be helpful and encouraging. I know Hannah has a heart that we would hear these stories and this insight and wisdom from those in China living as believers and be encouraged by it and even be challenged by it. So we hope that's true of you as you finish off this episode. Megs, what would you say is a highlight for you from this conversation?
Well, I just agreeing with the idea, first of all, that it's really helpful for us to hear voices other than our own, outside of North America. And maybe particularly in this case, and it's hard to be really keen on the topic of suffering, but the idea that suffering is not as unusual for some of our sisters and brothers as it is for me in the West. I don't live in a place where I often physically suffer. And yet to realize that it can be normal, and it is normal for some of my Christian friends, that was just a healthy reminder for me. And I'm glad to be reminded. It helps me pray. It helps me be thankful here. And I think it helps me prepare maybe that if and when it comes to me, that it's not as unusual as it might seem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we listened to this episode, it was a good reminder that there are Christians all over the world, even examples in the Bible of believers facing persecution and suffering that might not be normal to us, but there are examples of people we can look to who are suffering well and suffering faithfully, and we can learn from those examples. And that's such a blessing of being a part of the global church. So what a great conversation.
A rich topic here. Well, friends, this podcast is part of the Global Missions Toolbox, and we hope you'll stop by the website to check out the online collection of resources there, especially for senders, pastors and missions committees, and family and friends of workers sent out to serve in missions. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.